1870 to 1874. Now keep in mind this is still part of Congressional Reconstruction, but we're also starting to see a change within this time period, and many historians really say from like 1870 through 1877, you almost see a counter Reconstruction era. But even that you can break into two different phases. So I'm going to look at this phase first and then the next. During this time period, we're seeing that racism is basically going to kill Republican rule in the South. Racism is going to deepen divisions within the Republican Party. It also encouraged white violence against African Americans. And racism also eroded the support that the North had for Southern Republican governments. And in fact, we're going to see Northerners are going to respond to the increasing amount of violence in the South with this growing sense of tedium. Basically, Northerners in the end are going to accept arguments made by white Southerners that, oh, it's folly to allow Black people to vote or hold office. And so basically with that, you're seeing that Northerners are finding these Southern racist ideals to be acceptable. So when we're looking at violence that is going on during this time period, though, we're seeing a lot of this comes as a reaction to African Americans, because African Americans are moving around, they're attempting to vote, they are, haggling their labor contracts, they're carrying arms as they were part of like union forces and everything. And then on top of that, they're competing for jobs in cities against white people. So we're going to see this backlash comes predominantly from white paramilitary groups. And of course, the best known of these is the Ku Klux Klan. The thing is, while some of this violence was to subvert the electoral process and thus political, that's not the case for all the violence at this time. You see a lot of violence against African Americans where they will, not even just against African Americans, I should say, we see a lot of violence during this time period in the South because basically white people would strike against anyone, Black or white, that they see as violating racial boundaries. They killed that Black man because he could read or write, and just such a thing just ought not to be. Now, the federal government is going to respond to this violence with a variety of legislation, such as like we saw with the 15th Amendment. The other legislation they put forward is things like the Enforcement Act of 1870 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. So the Enforcement Act of 1870 basically authorized the federal government to appoint supervisors in states that were failing to protect voting rights. So if the state isn't protecting voting rights, looking at African Americans in particular, then the federal government will step in. The Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 is going to permit federal authorities to arrest and prosecute members of groups that were denying citizens civil rights if, once again, the state failed to do so. So if the state isn't protecting its citizens and guaranteeing their civil rights, such as African Americans, then the federal government can come in and persecute members of these kinds of groups, like the Ku Klux Klan. The thing is, this is really going to establish a new precedent when it comes to federal-state relations. It's showing, once again, the federal government is over the state governments. But these acts were really not successful in curbing racial violence. What's really happening during this time is there's just a failure on the will on the part of Northern Republicans to see through their commitments for Southern African Americans. They aren't going to see through their commitments when it comes to their Southern Republican administrations. Their commitment to voting rights and civil rights for Black Southerners just fades over time. basically Northerners are going to be tired of constantly combating Southerners on stopping them from being racist. The best way to explain this that I have found has been comparing it to donation fatigue. If you think back like a few years ago in 2017, we had a bunch of different hurricanes hit the United States. The one that you might know more about living in Texas would be like Hurricane Harvey that particularly ravaged Houston. However, there was at least 2 hurricanes before Harvey that hit parts of the United States, and after Harvey, there's Hurricane Maria that like particularly hit Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States. And the thing is, think about how many people you know gave some sort of like money or donated something to the victims of one of these hurricanes. But then also think about how many people you know that gave money or donated something for the victims of every single one of these hurricanes. This is basically called donation fatigue. People get tired of, oh, I gave to the last hurricane, how come there's another hurricane? And it's like, we can't control that, but it feels like your money isn't going anywhere when there's just a whole nother hurricane. And so that's basically what's happening here. Not that it excuses the Northerners by any means, but they just got tired of fighting for the rights of African Americans and fighting for the Republican-controlled governments in the South. Basically, they got tired of fighting against racism and began to accept it. The other thing about this is politics in the 1870s really was becoming increasingly corrupt and irresponsible. We see like federal officials allowed private individuals to manipulate the stock market for gain. We have members of Congress, and actually the vice president himself actually exchanged government favors for railroad stock. And the thing is, a lot of Americans are going to connect this corruption unfairly with the fact that America had expanded the right to vote to Black people. So you see this racism coming out again. And this is when people start saying, oh, the vote is a privilege to be earned, it's not a right. And then they would make the argument that Black people simply hadn't earned it. Of course, it's questionable what they would have expected them to do to earn it, but there you go. We're also going to see with these kinds of ideas of racism, another part of racism is the growing support amongst intellectuals of scientific racism. This is going to gain respectability, unfortunately, in the late 19th century, and you can see the images here and what they use to compare and everything. The other thing about all of this is the Republican Party, they are legislating over the United States right as an urban industrial economy is booming after the war. And Republicans benefited from that boom, but this also really influenced their priorities. The federal government is going to deny land to freedmen, but yet they dole out millions of acres to corporations. So there was an element of who were they going to get more out of politically. And once again, we're looking at some of that corruption. Calls for reform are going to come out across the nation as well due to the emerging scandals of Grant's administration. Grant is not a great president. He was a good general in the Civil War. He's not a politician by any means. And we're going to see Republican governments are going to be condemned in both the North and the South for all their like lavish spending and like high taxes.